For years, Canada has comforted itself with a quiet idea that when pressure from Washington grows, Ottawa can simply look elsewhere. That China, vast, powerful, impatient, might serve as a counterweight. I understand the appeal of that story. In a world of rising great power rivalry, hedging sounds sophisticated, flexible, smart. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Some relationships are not hedgeable. Canada's bond with the United States is not a policy choice. It is a structure, built over generations, locked in by geography, security, capital, and people. Pretending it can be balanced by Beijing is not strategic creativity. It is strategic fantasy. And fantasies matter in geopolitics, because when they collapse, real costs follow. Jobs, security, sovereignty, credibility. If you care about how power actually works in the world, not how we wish it worked, stay with me. Because to understand Canada's China debate, we first have to confront what Canada really is. And that story begins not in Beijing, but much closer to home. What then is the real question Canada is facing? It is not whether Canada should trade with China. It already does, and it will continue to do so. The real question is more subtle and more dangerous. Can Canada use China as leverage against the United States? Can engagement with Beijing meaningfully offset American pressure? That is where the debate goes wrong. Hedging is not a slogan. In strategic terms, it has a precise meaning. It requires credible alternatives, partners that can replace or at least rival what you already depend on. For Canada, that means alternatives for three things that define state power: security guarantees, intelligence cooperation, and access to markets at scale. On all three, the United States is not just Canada's primary partner, it is the system itself. This is not sentiment, it is structure. And once you see that structure clearly, the China hedge stops looking bold. It starts looking incoherent. To understand why, we need to step back into history, institutions, and the mechanics of dependence. That context changes everything. Then let's widen the lens. Canada's relationship with the United States did not emerge from ideology or coincidence. It was built through time, repetition, and mutual dependence, the quiet forces that shape power more reliably than declarations. Over decades, Canada and the US constructed a continental system. Trade first, then supply chains, then security, then intelligence, each layer reinforcing the next. Today, more than $900 billion in goods cross the border every year, not shipped across oceans, but moved through integrated production networks. Cars assembled in Ontario rely on parts from Michigan. Energy flows north and south without pause. Aerospace, automotive, agriculture, industries optimized for continental efficiency, not global optionality. Security followed the same logic. NORAD bound Canadian and American defense into a single operational architecture. Intelligence sharing deepened quietly, year after year, until disentanglement became unthinkable. And beneath the treaties lies something more powerful: millions of informal ties between provinces and states, universities and firms, families and communities. No president can simply switch those off. This is what structural dependence looks like. Not fragility, but depth. And it explains why replacing the United States is not just unlikely, it is impossible. Which makes the search for a hedge all the more perilous. Because when the first real test comes, theory gives way to crisis. And Canada has already seen how that plays out. Then came the moment when theory met reality. In 2018, Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, acting on a US extradition request. Within days, two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were detained in China. No charges that made sense, no transparency, no timeline. They would remain imprisoned for nearly 3 years. This was not an accident. It was a signal. China was demonstrating a tool it had refined against others: hostage diplomacy, a message delivered not through speeches, but through lives. The economic response followed quickly. Canadian canola exports were suddenly restricted. Farmers across Western Canada absorbed losses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This pattern was familiar. Australia faced punitive tariffs after questioning Beijing's behavior. South Korea saw tourism collapse after deploying missile defense. The lesson was consistent and unmistakable. When Beijing is displeased, it retaliates, publicly, selectively, and without regard for long-term trust. If you're watching this and thinking, that was an exception, pause. It wasn't. It was a preview of the costs middle powers pay when they mistake access for alignment. And it raises a deeper question. If China is willing to burn massive economic relationships to enforce obedience, what kind of hedge does that really offer? Because the danger isn't confrontation, it's dependency without protection. And that leads us to the system beneath the surface, the mechanism that makes this risk structural, not episodic. What sits beneath all of this is a simple but unforgiving mechanism: asymmetry. Canada's trade with China is real, but scale matters in geopolitics, and the scale is lopsided. Canada trades tens of billions with China. It trades hundreds of billions with the United States. That imbalance creates leverage, and Beijing knows how to use it. China's political economy is not designed to separate commerce from coercion. State power, market access, and political compliance are fused. When a dispute arises, the system does not look for compromise. It looks for pressure points. For a middle power, that changes the risk equation entirely. If your partner is willing to absorb massive economic losses to achieve political objectives, then trade becomes a vulnerability, not insurance. Canada experienced this directly, and so did others. The deeper problem is not any single retaliation. It is predictability. When patterns repeat across countries and regions, they stop being anecdotes. They become structure. And structure is what strategy must respond to. Which is why the idea of hedging through China collapses under scrutiny. Hedging assumes optionality. China offers exposure. Exposure without guarantees, without reciprocity, without mechanisms for restraint. And that brings us to the next escalation, not economic, but political. Because pressure doesn't stop at trade, it moves inward, into institutions, into communities, into the democratic process itself. And when that line is crossed, the stakes change completely. Pressure does not always arrive at the border. Sometimes it arrives quietly, inside the system. Recent intelligence assessments in Canada describe a sustained campaign of foreign interference, targeting diaspora communities, intimidating critics, attempting to shape political outcomes. These are not abstract warnings, they are documented patterns. When a foreign power seeks influence, not just over policy, but over process, the issue is no longer diplomacy, it is sovereignty. For a middle power, this creates a second layer of vulnerability. Economic exposure on the outside, institutional pressure on the inside. And here, again, asymmetry matters. China does not need Canada to comply on everything. It only needs uncertainty, silence, hesitation. That is often enough. The strategic mistake is to treat these pressures as separate issues. Trade here, security there, interference somewhere else. In reality, they are part of the same system, a system that rewards compliance and punishes resistance, gradually, selectively, relentlessly. This is why partnership and engagement are not interchangeable concepts. Engagement assumes distance. Partnership assumes trust. And trust is not built through coercion. As this pressure accumulates, it forces a choice, not in theory, but in daily governance. What do you prioritize? What do you defer? What risks do you quietly absorb? That burden does not fall on institutions alone. Eventually, it lands on people, on households, on workers, on communities that absorb the cost of strategic miscalculation. And that is where the conversation must turn next. And this is where geopolitics stops being abstract. Because when strategy fails, you feel it first. You feel it when markets close overnight and livelihoods disappear without warning. When farmers watch exports vanish because a political line was crossed far away from their fields. When researchers hesitate before collaborating. When community leaders lower their voices, not out of agreement, but fear. Foreign interference is not a headline problem. It is a human one. Diaspora communities carry the heaviest burden. Families caught between loyalty to a democratic home and pressure from an authoritarian state abroad. Voices muted, critics watched, participation chilled. And while governments debate strategy, people live with uncertainty. This is the cost of mistaking access for safety, of assuming economic ties create protection, of believing engagement alone can substitute for leverage. If you are watching this and wondering why strategy matters, this is why. Because national choices quietly shape personal lives. Canada's strength has never come from pretending to be something it isn't. It has come from clarity, from knowing where it stands, and who stands with it. If you believe strategy should serve citizens, not expose them, pause here, reflect, and share this conversation. Because the next question is even larger. What happens when these pressures ripple outward, beyond borders, into the global system itself? And that is where the stakes rise again. Those pressures do not stop at Canada's borders. They propagate. In a tightly connected world, middle powers act as transmission points. What happens to them signals what is possible elsewhere. When China applies economic coercion against Canada, or Australia, or South Korea, it is not just settling bilateral disputes. It is testing the system, measuring how much resistance costs, and how isolated each country really is. The effects are cumulative. Allies watch. Markets adjust. Smaller states recalculate their own red lines. This is how regional pressure becomes global influence. For Canada, the implications extend far beyond Beijing and Washington. They touch the Arctic, where Russia and China increasingly coordinate. They shape Indo-Pacific dynamics, where credibility matters more than declarations. They affect alliances built on trust, trust that partners will not fracture under pressure. Global influence today is less about dominance than about reliability. Who absorbs costs? Who stands firm? Who quietly adapts? Canada's choices feed into those answers, which is why strategic alignment is not submission, it is signaling. When Canada invests in continental defense, it reassures allies. When it protects democratic institutions, it strengthens norms. When it chooses focus over overreach, it preserves credibility. The world is watching how middle powers respond to constraint, not with slogans, but with behavior. And that brings us to the hardest part of any strategic analysis: the future, not as prediction, but as choice. 3 paths, 3 outcomes. So what comes next depends less on ambition and more on discipline. There are 3 plausible paths ahead. The first is clarity. Canada accepts the structure it operates within. It manages the US relationship deliberately, not defensively. It invests in Arctic sovereignty, continental defense, and institutional resilience. It diversifies trade where it can, but without pretending diversification replaces alignment. China remains a trading partner, not a strategic backstop. This path is unspectacular, but it is stable. The second path is ambiguity. Canada continues to speak the language of hedging without the capacity to execute it. Engagement expands, risk accumulates, decisions are deferred, pressure grows quietly, unevenly, until options narrow. This is not collapse, it is drift. The third path is illusion. Canada doubles down on strategic fantasy, treating access as leverage and engagement as insurance. When the next crisis comes, retaliation is sharper, institutions are tested, public trust erodes, and choices are made under duress, not design. Great powers can absorb mistakes. Middle powers cannot. The lesson here is not pessimism, it is proportionality. Strategy is not about having every option. It is about choosing the right ones early, before reality forces the decision for you. And that brings us to the final question. Not what Canada wants the world to be, but how it chooses to operate in the world as it is. Canada does not lack options. It lacks the luxury of illusion. Geography, history, and power have already drawn the outer boundaries of its strategy. Within those boundaries, there is still room for agency, but only if Canada is honest about the world it inhabits. The mistake is not trading with China. It is confusing trade with trust, mistaking engagement for insulation, believing that middle powers can float freely between giants without paying a price. Canada's influence has never come from moral posturing alone. It has come from being indispensable, from showing up where it matters, from carrying weight, not just opinions. That means defending the Arctic before others define it for you, strengthening institutions before they are tested, contributing to shared security before asking for consideration, and managing the US relationship not as a burden, but as a strategic asset. This is not a romantic vision of foreign policy, it is a realistic one. And realism, in an age of pressure, is not weakness, it is strength with open eyes. If this analysis helped you see Canada's position more clearly, share it. If you want the next video on how middle powers survive great power rivalry without losing sovereignty, stay with me. Because the most dangerous strategies are not the aggressive ones, they are the comforting ones, and the world is no longer forgiving.